Well, thanks for being here today. Glad you have joined us. Looking forward to looking into the Word of God together. We are in Luke chapter 16. We're going to read 13 verses there. So if you have a Bible, grab a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. We have one for you. There are a couple in the back. You can grab those. There's easy access ones actually should be right under one of the pews in front of you, the little chairs, and a little metal rack underneath there. You could reach down, grab one of those. I don't know the page number, but I do know it's Luke 16. So if you want to find Luke 16 in your Bible, on your phone, or in one of the Bibles in the chairs, please grab that. We'll be in there together. Or you can just read along with me as I read on the screen. You can do that as well. Here's what we do typically, I think every time that we read the Bible, is we don't take it for granted. It's a blessing to have God's Word. And so what we're going to do is this. I'll read. You can just follow along as I read. And then once we're done, just by way of saying thank you to God, I'll say, "This is the word of the Lord," and we can all say together, "Thanks be to God." That's how we do this. I'll read Luke 16, 1 through 13, and then we'll say, "Thanks be to God." He, Jesus, also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager. And charges were brought to him that this man, the manager, was wasting his possessions. The owner called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." This is the reading of the word. Thanks be to God. Well, you know what? As we look at this passage, I think we can find that it's somewhat confusing. How many of you, as we read, were like, you know what? A little bit confusing. You want an informal poll? It's okay. I'm not judging any of you. I just like, because I've read it before. I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. It's a little confusing, isn't it? Feels a little bit problematic. Maybe we're like, I'm not sure what to do with this passage. There's some things there that I just have question marks. And there's not one, there's like 7, As you look, you're like, I don't know what is going on. This week, I had a number of friends and people who knew I was preaching, and they were just telling me, hey, I'm praying for you. What's your passage? Well, I'm on Luke 16, the dishonest manager. And they're like, oh, no. Sorry, that's a tough one. There are some sticky things in there, some things that are a little confusing. And I think you guys probably felt a bit of that. You know, historically, this has been considered one of the toughest passages in the Gospel of Luke because what's going on? What's happening here? There are actually a lot of different commentators and early theologians who had questions about what's going on. Let me tell you about one of them. His name was Julian the Apostate. Just by the way, if you have a nickname called the Apostate, that's a bad nickname, okay? You have a bad nickname if you're considered an apostate, especially if you're called Julian the Apostate, okay? Well, this guy actually liked this passage because he tried to use it to twist and discredit Jesus' message, scoffing at what he thought this passage was teaching. So it's a little bit problematic. There are others who would write and say, well, it is impossible to recover what the parable of the unjust steward originally meant. Tough words, difficult concepts, what's going on? Impossible. Step back, move on over to Luke 16, verse 14, Leave this one alone, this one's a little tough. Well, you know what the only problem is? What about 2 Timothy 3:16? You know what that says? I think you do. All Scripture is breathed by God and is profitable. I think that might even mean Luke 16, 1 through 13, right? So at some level, even though it's a little confusing, even problematic, we got to be like, okay, God, you have something you want to teach us from this passage. So give me ears to hear. Give us hearts to understand. Give us lives that submit to you. The structure of the passage today is a little bit different. I want to tell you about it. It's broken up in two segments, okay? I think I'm going to give you a little background information, and then we're going to hop into the what does this really mean, okay? So stick with me for a little bit if you don't mind. There are two segments. I think you could probably feel them a bit, okay? The first segment is Luke 16, 1 through 8a, the first half of 8, and that's a parable. That's the confusing part. That's the problematic side. It's a parable. And then the other portion, Luke 16, 8, the second half through the end, that's actually a highly crafted, beautiful, poetic writing. You see, what we have here is on the first half, we've got something that feels problematic and kind of provocative in the story. It's like trying to get our attention, wake us up. And then on the second half, we have this poem that's just expertly crafted. It even has puns in the original language. There are nuances of this that's like, whoa, this is amazing. It's very carefully written and carefully delivered to get attention and to help us learn. You see, here's the point. It's a skillful presentation of truth. It's something we have to understand. It's something so important. Jesus tells this in-depth story with question marks all around it because there's something we need to learn. Okay, so for us to learn that, though, we're going to have to talk about some of the people involved. If you're going to understand a story, you've got to understand who's involved in the story. You know that. You learned that in second grade, third grade, right? Who are the people in the story? Well, let's talk about them. Let's see who these people are. First of all, we have the obvious person. Who's the most obvious person in the story? Okay, it's the dishonest manager, right? You found him? It's the dishonest manager. Now, some of you might have in your text, if they have headings that might say unjust steward or dishonest manager, they're both communicating the same thing. Here is a person who there is not a momentary lapse of judgment. This is a lifelong pattern of being unethical and unjust. It's a dishonest person by nature. Now, he's the main protagonist in the story. Some would say he's a pretty rotten fellow. Would you agree? How many of you would like him to be your friend? Nope, not your friend. Okay, good. I think you're with me. Now, we don't know the whole story, but at some level, this person in middle management, he's an estate manager for a wealthy landowner. This middle manager has been mismanaging funds. Did you see that in verse 1? He's been mismanaging funds. We don't know the extent of his mismanagement, but we do know that the problem is big enough. It's been happening for long enough, and the reports have come back enough times and been verified enough that now the owner is like, I have to do something. This is not just a suspicion, this is verified fact. I have a dishonest manager. So that's our first person, dishonest manager. Let's move over to the owner. Who is this owner? Well, he's wealthy. He's a landowner. And actually, it seems to imply that he's evidently respected in the community. You know where I would get that from? As you look at the parable, who gets accused of being unjust? The manager. Well, if there was anything wrong with the owner, they would just say, well, it's the owner, and he's teaching all of his people this is the way you do business. No. They knew not the owner. The owner is ethical. The owner is respected. He's not accused of mismanagement, just his manager. Not only is he well respected, he's just. He does what's right. Now think about it. If you are a wealthy business owner and you got someone who's just fudging some numbers and making things look a little better and messing with things, and they're a dishonest manager, if you are not just and honest, you might like that manager. They're making a little extra profit for you. They're helping those numbers, but not this owner. This owner is a just owner, and what he does is he finds out about the injustice and the dishonesty being done, and he fires him instead of profiting from his dishonesty. We also get the idea from this passage that he's both generous and merciful. You see, he could have called that manager into his office, I don't know what it was, home, his space, and said, what have you done? Outside the door, they're the authorities. They're going to take you to jail right away. And that would have been just fine. People would have expected that to happen. But he's merciful. He's generous. He could have easily taken this man and thrown him right in jail. No one would have batted an eye. You know what? As we look at this story, we have a very remarkable owner. Who else is in the story? Well, there are the tenants. Do you catch it in verse 5 through 7? We got some people who owe a debt. They're called debtors. But we would understand them as tenants. You see, the wealthy owner was a landowner. He would lease out his land to farmers who would work the fields, who would then pay back the lease by using some of the crops from their produce. Each of the lease agreements had different amounts of produce required based on the amount of land they leased, the type of produce they did, all, the arrangements, just normal business practice. But what they did was they had a set amount that they paid for using the land. These things were all written down in a ledger. The estate manager, the person who's dishonest, it was his job to watch over the land, watch over the tenants, and watch over the best interest of the owner. But this guy obviously did not. We've seen the three obvious people in the story, but there's another one as well. It's the accusers, and it's the community. And though we don't need to take long, I think it's good to note that what we're talking about is actually a first century parable. And in this time, Jewish culture, community was very important. You can see because the man here is saying, well, I can't go out and beg. People know me. I've worked in this community. We see that they really care about how the owner and the manager are treating the tenants and handling money. The community cares about how things are done and that it's done right. That gives us a look at some of the people involved in the story. Now, as we read this story, we're trying to move along through this first 8 verses. We're trying to understand what's the big idea, what's the point? And it's like we're driving down a road, but we keep getting stopped along the way. How many of you have driven down a road lately and you found a pothole? You found it with your tire. Now you need new shocks. You messed something up. Hopefully you didn't blow a tire. We've all hit potholes, right? We've all hit speed bumps, things that just make it hard to move forward in an orderly fashion in our vehicle. It just slows us down, messes us up. Well, I think our passage has a few potholes, you might call them, in the story. It's just things where we can get stuck and we can bump along in our attempt to understand the passage. So let me show you 3 potholes and show you how, once we look at them, they're not as big of a pothole as we think they are. Pothole number 1, or problem number 1. If you go to verse 5 through verse 7, it says this. This is the section where the estate manager gets the debtors or tenants and starts changing numbers. Now, that seems like a pretty big pothole. It's like, wait, what's happening? How could that even happen? How is it possible to make these sort of changes? They seem significant, and they were. They were a year to a year and a half's wages for a common laborer. So any tenant who got that big of a windfall would be thrilled. How could the tenants be so gullible? Who all is really in on this deception? Do you see the pothole getting bigger and bigger? We're like, I don't know, something fishy's going on. Well, just think about it. Back then in first century Jerusalem, they didn't have Excel, right? They didn't have Excel to keep track of all their different debts, incomes, and payments. They didn't have a nicely organized P&L, if you know profit and loss statements. They didn't use QuickBooks Online. They actually operated out of handwritten ledgers. So for the middle manager, the estate manager, for him to take the ledgers out and to say, well, just make this small change here, change this and that, you just got an amazing deal. That wasn't a big deal. He could actually just, with a few strokes of the pen, change some numbers and really have a positive impact on these tenants. So naturally we'd say, oh, okay, so the estate manager and the tenants are in cahoots. They're working together. Well, not really, because think about it. It's not uncommon for a business owner to show generosity. It doesn't help him if his farmers have no money to provide and no money to buy seed and no money to keep working. He wants them to continue to produce. So it's in his best interest if they're doing well and he's doing well. They just got to find the right middle ground. Well, it's not uncommon too in cases of drought or bad crop yield or other issues for an owner to say, you know what? I want to give you a discount for this year. And it seems like that's probably what these tenants thought was happening. From their point of view, it made complete sense. And did you also catch it? They had no idea this guy was fired. This was just business as usual. They were like, oh man, there is no way he would give us this big of a discount without the owner saying, give him the discount, because then he's going to be fired. They didn't know he already was. So this pothole is not as big of a problem as we thought. Let's move on to pothole number 2. We can find this one in verse 8, where we start to say, wait, what's going on? Something is just odd. Verse 8 says this, the master commended the dishonest manager. Now, that should seem very weird indeed, and I get it. Like, even as I studied and early on, it's like, what is going on here? We better do some in-depth digging to understand what's happening in this passage, because something's really weird. How can the owner say anything nice about this man at all, right? Wait a second. Didn't you just say that he has been mismanaging his funds for a long enough time period that everybody knows, and now he's fired? And then he compound interests that with something even worse, robs. What's going on? How can this owner say something nice? Well, it's not uncommon even today. Let's say someone gets fired at your company. Someone gets fired at your work. Often, they'll be let go, but we find it somewhere inside of us to say something nice. You know, they needed to be let go, but they always did make nice cupcakes. I don't know. They did make me laugh a few times. They always did dress really well. You know, we find something to compliment them. Yeah, they were really bad at accounting, but they made phenomenal chili. And they saved the turtle once. We can find something to praise everyone. But do you notice what the owner did not say? He didn't commend him for his honesty, did he? He didn't commend the dishonest manager for his character, his crooked heart, his style of management, his integrity, or his ethics. He didn't commend him for any of that. There was one thing and one thing only he commended him for. What was that? Yeah, shrewdness. Now, I think typically when we now define someone or something as shrewd, is that a positive or a negative? Yeah, most often I see it. Most often it's negative. I had someone in the first service, I said shrewd, and they went, ooh, like that. Because that's like our instinctive reaction. Someone's acting shrewd. Someone's being shrewd. We're like, man, grab my wallet, watch out. They're going to take advantage of me. And so our concept of shrewdness is almost entirely negative. But in the first century, they actually had a different idea. It wasn't just negative. There were some positive pieces. Shrewd actually meant skillful wisdom. So the owner is saying, well, this person at least had some wisdom. This person finally understood what is really important. You could think of words like perceptive. Now, the owner is not praising the dishonest manager's morals, but he's praising his perception and his astuteness. Do you get the difference? Here would be one way of saying it. A biblical scholar named T.W. Monson said it this way. He said the owner would, in essence, be saying something like this. This is a fraud, but it is a most ingenious fraud. This steward is a rascal, but he is a wonderfully clever rascal. Weak praise, yes, we get it. But he recognized something. This man started to understand what really matters. So we've looked at pothole number 1, I called it, and pothole number 2. Can I show you one final pothole where people are like, wait, it kind of gives us pause before we try to understand the parable. It messes us up a bit. The last one is just taking the parable as a whole. And we would say, wait a second, why is it that Jesus can use a dishonest manager as a hero in the parable? Like, how can this be that Jesus made this man the hero? He didn't. He's not a hero. He got fired. He's just the main character in the story. He's the main protagonist. Think about how we are with modern stories. We have characters like Gru in Despicable Me, right? We got characters like the Grinch. We have characters like Scrooge. We actually really like stories that have bad people and then something happens and they understand. So we get this. We like stories with slightly unsavory characters. They don't bother us. So let's not be bothered by Jesus' parable where there's someone here. You know, the point is, the best stories, the best fables, the best parables, they aren't full of prim and proper people. They're impactful because they paint a clear picture. They're impactful because a central teaching is made very clear. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's painting a picture so we can clearly understand the main point of what's happening. So then we should just ask the question, what is the main point? Let's look at it. It comes down to verse 8. So in verse 8, we're back to what the owner said. The owner commended the honest manager for his shrewdness. And that is the point. Shrewdness is the ability to judge a situation. It's being astute. It's being perceptive. In other words, we could say it this way in our common language, in our common use. Shrewdness is knowing what really matters. Shrewdness is knowing what really matters. Think about how the dishonest manager started. Verse 1, he started by living life very large, wasting possessions and misusing funds. But as soon as he is called in to report to the boss, he says, wait, what really matters? And all of a sudden, he chooses to pivot away from these possessions as being the end goal in and of themselves to the possessions being a means to the end of getting housing and a job and a secure future. He was shrewd. He understood what really matters. In this parable, we find a despicable man who was able to steal shrewdly and plan for his future. Now, we don't admire what is despicable. We don't commend what is condemnable, but we learn the one lesson that we're supposed to learn from this parable, and it's to ask ourselves the question, what really matters? You see, if an unsavory man like this dishonest manager can learn, can learn the lesson, what really matters, shouldn't all of us learn the exact same lesson as well? If someone as bad and unethical as this can learn what really matters, shouldn't we too? So let's dive in, after a drink, into verse 8, okay? Excuse me. What really matters? So we're going to seek to answer that question, and we're going to look at three different things in our time. What really matters? Jesus steps in and says, these three things really matter. The first one is live for eternity. The first one is live for eternity. And we'll see that here in verse 8 and verse 9. If you look at verse 8, we're called to live for eternity, and the verse says this. The sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their generation than the sons of light. Remember, while our typical definition of shrewd is negative, that is not the case here. Hey, Ty, would you get me a water? Another one? Thanks, bud. That's my oldest. He'll help me out. Got some tickle in my throat. Okay, back to what I was saying, though. But this is not the case, right? Shrewdness normally we think is all entirely negative. Jesus here is not saying the sons of this world are more shrewd and you should be shrewd as well in a negative sense. He's not saying, it's really kind of bad. The children of light are not living more devious lives like everyone around them. That's not what Jesus is saying, is it? Jesus is not saying, you should be more dishonest in your dealings. No. Jesus is saying, actually live for eternity. Remember, this is poetry. It's full of parallelism. So reading the end of verse 8, we should actually anticipate some unstated parallelism. As we read it, we should be thinking this. The verse says, the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their generation than the sons of light are in dealing with their generation. We have two different people. We have two different worlds. Here's what's being said. The sons of this world know what really matters to live in their world, in their generation, and to be successful in their time. They really get what it means to be successful and what matters right now in their world that is passing away, their world that will end. But in contrast, the sons of light don't know how to live for their world. And what world is that? That's heaven. They are so wise and they know what to do, what really matters for life on earth. And sometimes sons of light are not even aware of what really matters in living for eternity. The world is able to wisely plan for as long as their generation or their lives last. They're awake and they're aware to the needs and nuances of their lives. They know what matters most for this world. But Christians, we belong to an eternal kingdom. We have tasted of eternity. We're standing on the edge of eternity, and we fail to think, plan, and prepare for eternity. Thanks, bud. These are the ones, right? The sons of this world are the ones who are acting more wisely and more shrewdly than us. That's what Jesus is trying to say. And he's saying, live for eternity. Jesus is saying one group knows how to live and the other does not. Let me try to paint the picture with you. It's like having two very different types of runners, but one of them is confused about which race they signed up for. One runner is going to compete in a fun run, and the other runner signs up for a triathlon. You can see behind me. There's a big difference between these two races, aren't there? Do we have any triathlon completers in our midst? All right, I would be deeply impressed. I think Ben Hulene is, and he's a phenomenal guy. These two different competitors might be running on the same day, they might be running in the same city, but they're running two totally different races, aren't they? You see, one is going to go 2 miles. They're going to get some cute little colors splashed on them like a color run through the process. They're going to finish up at the end. They're going to grab a Go-Gurt. They're going to pet a dog. They'll go home and watch some cartoons. Fun run done. The other is running a triathlon. They're just barely getting warmed up with 2 miles. A triathlon, an Ironman triathlon is 2.4 miles of swimming, if you can imagine that. It's 112 miles of biking, and it's a full 26.2 mile marathon. Two totally different races, two totally different race courses, two totally separate ways of training, two different sets of gear, two different sets of mindsets, and two very different finish lines. These two people are running very different races, and what really matters to complete a fun run is very different than what really matters to complete an Ironman triathlon. How sad it would be if someone signs up for the triathlon but prepares like they're running a fun run. They're going to be in a world of hurt, aren't they? Are you living your life with a fun run mentality while you should be training for an Ironman? Are we living not knowing what is really important, thinking about eternity? Jesus is saying in verse 8, live for eternity. We're also supposed to see in verse 9, we need to live for eternity. Would you mind reading the verse with me? It says this, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwelling. Now, this is kind of another problematic passage in a way, section of the passage. Is this passage telling us that we need to buy our friends with money? I'll take 2 friends, please. I'll go the extra premium route. I want really good friends, so I'll pay an extra $20. You know, is that what the passage is saying? Buy some really good friends. Well, no, that's not what it's saying. While that might be nice for those of us who might find it difficult in making friends, while it might be nice to be able to buy up some new friends, that's not what Jesus is saying. That doesn't coincide with what we find in Proverbs about how to build friendships. It doesn't even coincide with what we just heard from the previous parable. You remember the parable of the prodigal son? He tried this strategy. He had money. He tried to buy friends. Friends were around until the money was gone. And then the friends were gone. So buying friends with money doesn't work. So Jesus is not flip-flopping on stories. He's doing something else. Jesus isn't saying buy friendship, but instead he's saying invest money into something that is eternal and something that is for eternity. Invest in people. He's using the parable of an unjust steward as a template on which to teach. This man, the unjust steward, used money to gain his friends. But he's saying, no, you should be much wiser than that. Use your possessions for something and for someone that outlasts this life. Invest in eternity. Live for eternity. You see, when we look at the passage, we get some insights when we come to the end of verse 9. If you saw it, it says 2 things that are important. First is, so that when it fails, can you help me? What fails? What's going to fail? Okay, wealth is going to fail. What else is going to fail? Our life. Yeah. Both are going to fail. So we better be living for eternity. We better be planning. When they fail, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. They're already there. They're going to receive into the eternal dwellings. There are 2 meanings that I think are beautiful. The first one is this. You can actually invest money in eternal souls by giving generously for the sake of the kingdom and for the advance of the gospel right now. You can invest in eternal souls by generous kingdom giving and living right now. Give so that you'll be welcomed joyfully into heaven by eternal friends who benefited from your kingdom-minded financial generosity. Could you imagine with me for a second? Imagine what it is like to be in heaven. Like you finally made it. You're walking in paradise. You're experiencing the first day of eternity. Tears are gone. Sin is gone. The temptation and struggle is gone. It's awesome. And as you walk on streets of gold, all of a sudden, one person and another person comes up and they say, "Thank you so much." They express gratitude. Maybe it's people who have been saved at the rescue mission and you gave money or time to serve there. Maybe it's people who are part of the Pregnancy Resource Center where you donated time or money and you invested time or money that is right now bound to this earth and you sent it ahead and you invested it in eternity. Maybe some of the people who thank you are those who used to live in a little state called Utah. And somehow, your money that you gave for planting gospel-preaching churches had an impact, reached their neighborhood, and they're in heaven. That is what it means to invest in eternity. Maybe it's people from Southeast Asia who are saved because you paid money. You took some of your money and you invested it in Dan and Christy and Bree so they could go there and share the gospel to the unreached. That's kingdom investment. Maybe it's people here in Salt Lake City who heard of salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, because you just consistently, financially, sacrificially, and kingdom-mindedly gave to your local church. And this passage is saying there will be people who will welcome you because you lived wisely and you live for eternity with your money. But it's more than just that. It's more than just that. That's accurate, but it's also this. It wasn't uncommon in Jewish literature to use an idiom or a way of speaking to talk about God. They wanted to be very respectful, but they wanted to talk about God. Think about things like this. You know the verse where it says, "There is joy in the presence of the angels when a sinner repents"? Many would say that God is full of joy and rejoicing when people are saved. But to be respectful, people didn't talk about God specifically in that culture. And they say this is another example of the same thing. See, because the verse says this, so that when your money and your life fail, they, God, may receive you into the eternal dwellings. The verse describes both God and redeemed humanity welcoming a newly departed and generous, kingdom-minded believer into glory. What a beautiful picture. So we are called to live for eternity. A few final thoughts before we move to our second main point. We must give generously of our money for the furtherance of the gospel. If we're not doing so, we are not making proper use of what God has given us. Money can be and must be intensely spiritual. One commentator, Kent Hughes, says this: what we need to do is enlarge the vision and burden of those to whom God has given much. Who is that? That's us. So let me start again. What we need to do is enlarge our vision and our burden so we understand that we have an opportunity that is rare in the history of Christianity to substantially advance the way of Christ. Live eternally. What are creative and kingdom-sized ways in which you can use money, possessions, and everything for the advance of the gospel, and you can send ahead to eternity? Live for eternity. Your life and money on this earth will end, so live for eternity. Well, if we think back, we were saying The point of this parable is to ask the question, what really matters? You remember? And Jesus is pointing us in three directions. He says, what really matters, first of all, is to live eternally. But then what really matters, second of all, is to live faithfully. We find that in verses 10, verse 11, and verse 12. So we're called to live eternally. We're called to live faithfully. You know what this reminds me of? Here we go, Greg. It reminds me of the United States Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis. You guys know that? Greg's a Marine. He liked it when I shared this earlier in the first service. What does it mean? It means always faithful. And it's been the Marine motto since 1883. What's it stand for? It means that a Marine is faithful to the Marine on their right and to the Marine on their left. They're always faithful. It means a Marine is faithful to the mission, always faithful. They're faithful to the Marine Corps. They are always faithful. They're faithful to their community and they're faithful to their country. Their motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. I love it. I think it's a great motto for one of the branches of our armed service. I also think it's a good motto for what Jesus is telling us here in these three verses. We need to be always faithful. There are three things. Let's just look at each of the verses. Verse 10, verse 11, and verse 12. The first thing we see is in verse 10. And we're going to see by reading this passage that we are called to live faithfully no matter the amount. Live faithfully no matter the amount. Because the verse says this: one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. So the key there is faithfulness, no matter the amount. It's not if you have a little. It's not if you have a lot. But it's what you do with what you have. This means there's no exception clause. There's no exemption for different Christians. Faithful, no matter the amount. You see, wealthy people can live for God and love Him. When you flip through your brain and think through people of church history and people of the Bible, who do you think of who is wealthy, who loved God and lived for Him? Who do you think of? I thought of Abraham. He was pretty wealthy. I thought of Solomon, right? Solomon was pretty wealthy. How about David? He's a king. He was wealthy. What about the early church? You know, in the early church where they sold possessions and shared with those in need, they shared? There were wealthy Christians who loved God and lived for Him. But it's not just the wealthy who can love God and live for Him. Think about the poor. There have been scores who have been poor and loved God and lived for Him. Think about Job. He was wealthy. He got very poor. And he said, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." He still loved God. He still followed Him. Think about the widow in the New Testament. She had 2 little coins. She was poor, but she loved God, and she gave to Him. Think about our Savior, Jesus Christ. He was poor. He had no place to lay His head. And so what we are learning here is we must be faithful no matter the amount. Sadly, though, I think we have a problem. I think we have a sickness. I'm calling the sickness this. The sickness is the when I sickness. When I sickness. We don't want to be faithful no matter the amount because we've got a when I sickness. And it looks like this. I'll give when I am older. I'll serve when I have more time. When I settle down. When I get married. When I've saved enough. When I finally checked off those things on my bucket list. When I. Then I'll be faithful. But faithfulness, no matter the amount. That's what Jesus is calling us to. We've got to be careful about the when I syndrome and sickness. Because right now, you are actually pouring the concrete foundation of your life. You're pouring the foundation upon which everything else is going to be built. Did you catch it in the verse? Those who are faithful in a little are faithful in much. Those who are dishonest in a little are also dishonest in much. It's kind of like pouring concrete, or it's kind of like maybe you're into software development. Maybe it's like building a life operating system. You're coding right now your life operating system on how it's going to operate. And if you are dishonest with a little, you are setting the character and course of your future. Don't be deceived by the when I syndrome. Be faithful no matter the amount. So I would say, teens, build the right foundation. College students, build the right foundation. Young adults, young marrieds, build a right foundation. Be faithful no matter the amount. But that doesn't leave the rest of everyone else here out of the picture, because we are all called to be faithful no matter the amount. Whether you have little or a lot, be faithful. If you have a lot, don't be wasteful with the extra, but live faithfully no matter the amount. God is calling us to live faithfully. And then verse 11, we see something else. Would you mind looking with me at verse 11? Verse 11 shows us this. We need to be faithful in what matters most. You see, verse 11 says, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? There's a difference between what was just said. He said, if you're not faithful in unrighteous wealth, who's going to entrust you with the, did you catch it? True riches. Those two are not together. So that means we need to be faithful in what matters most. Most often we want to be very faithful with our money, budgets and pinching pennies, cutting coupons and being careful with our money because we want to be really faithful with our money. And that's not bad. But what Jesus is saying, don't just be faithful in money, be faithful in what is really important. Be faithful in what matters most, something of true value. What are these true riches? What's the things of God? True riches. It's the treasures of the kingdom. It's eternal life. It's the treasures in heaven. It's those things that only God can give you. That's what you need to be faithful with. It's the care of souls. It's gospel proclamation. It's missions work. It's the building up of the church itself. We can be so careful with our dollars and cents, but we can be so sloppy with true riches. Be faithful in what matters most. One commentator said this: worldly matters are not the matters that really matter. Worldly matters are not the matter that really matters. And what Jesus is saying here is redeem your money. Money, which could be an idol, can be connected to all manner of evil, can actually be redeemed both now and for eternity. And use that money for what matters most. If you can't be trusted with money, can you be trusted to handle the truth? You know, this is why God says pastors must not be lovers of money. This is why deacons should not be greedy. This is why church members and Christians should live as wise stewards with something as common and ordinary as a dollar. Because there are much more precious and valuable things that we should really be worried about and wise with. Can I ask you, what do you care more about and check more often? What do you care about and check more often? Is it your bank accounts and your retirement accounts and your statements? Are you checking your home valuations? Are you checking your investment portfolios morning, multiple times a day? While all the time not caring about the performance of even more important and true things, like the spirituality of your family, the spread of the gospel, and the sanctification of fellow members. Be involved with what is true riches. Be faithful with what matters most. Okay, so we've seen that we need to be faithful no matter the amount. We need to be faithful with what matters most. And then, can I show you verse 12 as we wrap up this section of be faithful? Would you mind looking with me at verse 12? And here we're going to find that we need to be faithful because who does it belong to? Who does it belong to? God. Verse 12. If you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? This verse teaches us that what we think we own really belongs to another. If you haven't been faithful with that which is another's, and who is that? It's God. Everything belongs to God. Do we recognize and live like everything is God's, and we are just stewards or investment managers or portfolio managers of God's wealth? You know, I think actually we are in danger of being the steward who mismanages in this parable. We can forget that everything that God has given us is not really ours, but His. And then we can misuse. Do you remember in verse 1? Charges were brought to him that this man was wasting the owner's possession. Are we wasting what really belongs to God? Luke 16 might actually be our story right now. If you're living like all of your things are your things, and you're using wealth just for yourself, you might be that dishonest manager. But can I encourage you and me? Let's not hide like he did. Let's not scheme like he did. Let's not presume on mercy. Let's rather run in confession and forgiveness and find God's grace. We need to live faithfully. And then lastly, as we look at this passage, we've seen that we need to live eternally, we need to live faithfully, and we come down to the final verse, verse 13, and we find that we need to live serving God. What matters most? Jesus has given this parable to teach us three things, and we're going to hop in the third one just a second. But we need to live eternally, we need to live faithfully, and we need to live serving God. Can we look at this final verse together? Verse 13. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, it would be possible for us as we think about this passage to read it and say, wait, it says you can't serve two masters. Is Jesus saying it is wrong to have two sources of income? Two jobs? Well, no, that's not it. Two sources of income might make your taxes more complicated, but that's not what Jesus was worried about here. He's not talking about two employment opportunities. He's actually saying two slaves, two masters. You're one person. You can't be a slave to two different people. You're either going to love one and hate the other, or you're going to hate the one and despise the other. You can't be a servant to both. Choose the master that you will serve. I think the best way, because we know money and we know this verse, I think the best way for us to try to think through this section is to ask a few diagnostic questions that maybe God would use to help us understand, who do I serve? Here's a question. Do you find your deepest satisfaction in things that God made or in God Himself? And how we answer shows who our master is. If your deepest satisfaction is not in God, then whatever else you put up there is an idol. Here's a quote that I found convicting and helpful. Both the miser, the workaholic, the overspender, and the person who spends a great portion of their time worrying about their finances. Each lives in service or slavery to unrighteous wealth. Who is your master? Maybe it's possible that we can be a slave to money, but we mask it very well. We know we shouldn't, so we cover it up. The diagnostic question would be this: are you spiritual primarily because you are successful? Are you spiritual because primarily you're successful? Would you be as godly right now if you had less money? Would your love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, or meekness be diminished if your bank account was diminished? Who is your master? Do we exhibit the fruit of the Spirit or the fruits of affluence? Our joy and our peace and our kindness with those around us rises and falls in correlation with our bank account. Who is your master? Most of us here today, myself included, we live in Western civilization. We need to take a good, long look to see all the idols that are lurking inside of our hearts. They're building little thrones, and they're threatening worship and service to our great God. Serve God alone. The Christians would say, all of my life, not this segment, this segment, this segment, this segment. No, all of my life, for all of my life, as long as I have life, all of it for all of my life is in service to God. Anything besides that, we have missed the beautiful revelation of God and the salvation offered us through Christ. It could be that money is what we serve, but our hearts are prone to worship anything and everything else. But Jesus here says, I am a better God than the dollar. I'm a better God than the dollar. Serve me. You see, our possessions can get crashed on the side of a freeway. Our possessions can corrode. The dollar fluctuates. The stock market crashes. Home values both rise and fall. But Jesus says, I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. My love will never run out. I will never leave you or forsake you. I am a better God. That's what Jesus says. Serve me. We need to live serving God. So what does this mean? It means that we need to use all that we are and all that we have to serve God. Yes, this passage points out money, but let's not just pigeonhole it just to money. We need to serve God. That means serving Him with our money, but serving Him with our talents. Serving Him with our jobs. Serving Him with our time. Yes, our money, but our homes, our cars, all of our possessions. It means serving Him with our children or serving Him with our relationships. All of it is in service to God. And if it's not in service to God, it's an idol. So Jesus kindly and wisely helps us ask the question, what really matters? And he says it's to live eternally, live faithfully, and live serving God. Now, as we conclude, we've finished verse 13. I think it's entirely possible that we get done with a passage on money, and it's very likely that we feel guilty or shame. We've just barely gotten a glimpse of the problem, but it looks really bad. The passage from Jesus is about two things: money, but also mercy. Jesus offers mercy. because God is kindly bringing up the problem to the surface so he can confess it while there is time to fix it. It's mercy because there's an owner in the parable who shows mercy, but that's just a foreshadowing and a pointing to a God who shows greater mercy. You see, that dishonest estate manager, he didn't realize that the wisest option was to confess and plead for the mercy of the owner. He tried to solve the problem on his own. Don't make the same mistake. God himself is merciful. He's merciful to those who don't deserve it, and he's forgiving to those who spiritually embezzle and spiritually rebel. It's only those who confess their sin who receive forgiveness. It's only those who call on God for salvation who are saved. As we close, I want to read Luke 16, verse 14. Because there were some who listened and they responded wrongly. You see, verse 14 says, the Pharisees who loved money heard all these things and they ridiculed Jesus. Don't be like the Pharisees who ridiculed Jesus and his teaching. They didn't ridicule because the teaching was wrong. They ridiculed because the teaching got way too close to what they loved and to their hearts. They were unable to handle the truth, so instead they mocked the messenger even though he was God. I invite you, let's respond to the Word of God and the Spirit of God. I'd like to ask a musician to come forward. Maybe they can close us in some music, and while they play, I'd like us to just think about a few questions. Which of these verses does God want you to submit to? Which of these verses did the Holy Spirit press in on your heart? How does God want you to change the way you live? What kingdom investments do you need to make? Are you living in the when I syndrome? Well, stop, confess, and follow God. Maybe you just need to ask God, who am I really serving? Then confess whatever God brings to mind and take one step closer to obeying God. Let's take this time and let's talk to God.